in Plato's Parmenides, and later on in Neoplatonic works from prominent figures like Plotinus and later on Pseudo-Dionysius, who inspired other theologians like Aquinas or Thomas Aquinas. All these writers sought to elucidate how the first cause of being remains ultimately inscrutable to finite human intellect and is supposedly beyond being. Needless to say, negative theology, when used in unison with cataphatic theology, the idea of positing God by positive descriptions, which to everybody's surprise, yes, negative theology in almost every framework, despite being the exact opposite of cataphatic theology, is used alongside it to establish these rich in mysticism theosophical frameworks, which is quite a popular way of approaching divinity. I mean, we've seen it with pure actuality, we've seen it with Neoplatonism, we've seen it with Cabala, we've seen it with Taoism, and it's quite a popular way of approaching divinity in general. It has influenced Christianity with some of the interpretation taking the word uttered by God, Yahweh, in the Bible to signify ineffability from negative theology. The words in question that are used to signify ineffability is God uttering, "I am who I am." Similarly, Thomas Aquinas, a well-known Italian priest, philosopher, and one of the many theologians that we've known of today that are prominent, well, he was also inspired by Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo-Dionysius is a Christian theologian and a Neoplatonic philosopher, being one of the more prominent people alongside Plotinus who advocated for negative theology, utilizing it in his approach to divinity. The idea of the one from Neoplatonism is his approach. It has actually been quite associated with the Ineffability thesis over time, which we'll talk about soon. The influence that Pseudo-Dionysius had on Thomas Aquinas can be seen in his approach to God. Actus purus, or sometimes called pure act or shortened from pure actuality, where he utilizes a style of approach using negation to posit God or God's essence to be unknowable. The influence doesn't even stop here. Negative theology is once again utilized in mathematics, well, naive set theory. This time it comes coined as a different idea, that is the idea of the reflection principle, which terms or coins the universe via the von Neumann's universe to be fundamentally ineffable. If you want more information in regards to that, it is best to watch my video on absolute infinity, as I explain this a little bit more thorough than I do right now. Its influence being radically more prominent in Eastern theosophical frameworks, from Buddhism with Nirvana, Taoism with Wuji and the unnamed Tao, and Hinduism with Brahma, and popular forms of mysticism like Gnosticism with the monad, and Jewish mysticism, Cabala, with the combination of Ein Sof, or sometimes called Ayin, and the fundamental core essence of God in Cabala, the Atzimus. Its influence even started reaching the realm of quantum physics, with the hollow movement from Bohm's wholeness and implicate order, well, posited by the physicists, also something that's kinda influenced by negative theology one way or another, which is something we're gonna cover in this video as well. This is where you start to ask yourself, what did the philosophers or theologians see in negative theology that the average Joe can't? Whether or not the average Joe is a logician or he isn't, these types of people are the people who form critics of negative theology. They come in two ways. The average Joe, the logician, having first finished his studies on propositional logic, the average Joe feels as if he has conquered the world. He comes across the notion of negative theology and finds it absurd. He regards intellect or rational as the sole proprietor for explanations for all things. Now, the average Joe fails to recognize the limits of intellect and rationale when it comes to explaining the origin of itself. Now, take it like this. How do you know? How do you know that you know or you don't know? One can question the foundations we use for knowledge infinitely, and if that's the case, should one ought to take rationale or intellect as the sole proprietor for everything in terms of explanation, including itself, if it can't quite adequately explain itself? For example, Neoplatonic philosophers take intellect to derive from the one, the source of everything. The one, as a result of preceding knowledge and creating knowledge, is completely external to knowledge or whatever knowledge instantiates, and is the highest being in the intelligibility hierarchy. The next type of average Joe is the one who comes and forms the critics of negative theology without understanding the full scope of negative theology itself or the implications of negative theology and its applications to maybe other theosophical frameworks or philosophical or even religious frameworks. Now, I won't dwell too much on this average Joe because this is the premise of the video, to give you insight as to what negative theology is and how it can be applied to theology in general. Now, in negative theology, there's a core element of itself, the ineffability thesis. Just to be clear, there's no singular approach at ineffability, so the ineffability thesis can technically vary with the methodology being used or the framework being used. However, as I've said beforehand, it's mostly been associated with the pseudo-Dionysus approach. Using this approach, he took the Godhead of the Neoplatonic doctrine to be beyond predicates several times, beyond being, beyond predicates, beyond intelligibility, and sometimes beyond what's knowable and even what's unknowable, the ineffable one which is also beyond ineffability itself. Since for any predicate given to God, it is not God, but something that God intrinsically exceeds, then if you have a hypothetical set of all possible predicates, one can provide for the Godhead, and for all these predicates, neither of those predicates can fully grasp the Godhead. For the Godhead exceeds such predicates, what are we left with? It is not nothing, because nothing is a predicate. It is also not something, because something is a predicate. It is not anything, and it is not anything, because all of those are predicates. It's just, yeah, that's what it is, silence. Because of the complex and yet still nuanced implications of the ineffability thesis, the application of it ends up seeming non-existent. Well, that's what the average Joe would say, right? But when one thoroughly analyzes the differences in philosophical, theosophical, and theological frameworks that utilize it, you get a different perspective that sides with the possible soundness of the ineffability thesis. Because we're going to be looking at the other popular approaches of negative theology, we should probably not speak about strictly the ones that don't use the maxed out version of the ineffability thesis, which derives from the pseudo-Dionysus approach. From Hinduism, there exists the ultimate reality, the ultimate first cause, the Brahman. It is a special type of ineffability. The Brahman uses the non-dualistic ultimate reality approach, where the ultimate reality exceeds the duality of subject and object. It is possible to know some aspects of it, such as that of it exceeding attributes, and as a result of it being non-dual in nature, it is also possible to know that it can create, as all things begin with it. The only difference between this type of ineffability is that the way in which we know of it reflects on its true nature. They don't distinguish between the aspects of it, since all predicates of it creating and being the first cause and it being non-dual are predicates that reflect on its core nature. It is a little weaker in terms of ineffability to that of the pseudo-Dionysus approach, just like most of the ones that we are about to cover in this specific section. The ineffability of the hollow movement in David Bohm's philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, refers to the idea that this underlying reality is difficult or impossible to express fully in words or conventional language. Bohm suggests that our language or thought processes are inherently limited and may not capture the profound nature of the hollow movement. The ineffability arises because of the hollow movement, which involves a deep and interconnected and dynamic process that goes beyond explicit and the observable aspects of reality. Bohm emphasizes that conventional language tends to break down when attempting to articulate the intricacies of this holistic and enfolding order. In essence, the ineffability of the hollow movement implies that while we can discuss and explore aspects of it conceptually, the full depth and richness of this underlying reality may elude and complete expression through language alone. It underscores the limitation of our linguistic tools in describing the profound interconnectedness of practically everything and the dynamic nature that the Bohm attributes to the hollow movement. In Bohm's wholeness and implicate order, the hollow movement, which is an indivisible force, this indivisibility largely making it ineffable, is quite interesting because this style of approach at ineffability is simply through this undivided nature, or the force that has no divisions intrinsically. There can be no explicit way of describing it or specifying it as a result. It can only be known implicitly as such through its particular manifestations that form its composition, while the totality of it can only be understood as being indivisible, and thus for all of its compositions they are not a part of it but they are it, and not explicitly the totality of its nature can never be adequately described through language outside of the fact that it's actually just indivisible, which is like the basis for the ineffability to begin with. This approach of ineffability can either be taken as weaker than the Hinduism's approach or on equal terms, thus making it indeterminate. Then comes Buddhism's approach, which is eerily nuanced. The sunyata is the void that is just devoid of distinguishing characteristics. It is seemingly beyond the binary restrictions of being and not being, or non-being, and is the ultimate truth. Now, before we go far, it is important to note that non-being here is in reference to nothingness. Non-being can be in reference to a non-dual state of existence as well, just like in Cabala or in Taoism, where Wuji is the ultimate reality that's unrestricted from dual restrictions, and the undifferentiated state of reality, which is the source of all attributes, limitation, and dualities, as Teiji is born from Wuji, which is responsible for limits and dualities in general. Similarly, Sunyata is a nothingness that is not dual with somethingness, as it is a nothingness that negates nothingness, which means it's practically beyond their conventional definition of non-being, which is just nothingness. The second approach is for Nirvana. Both Nirvana and Sunyata are closely related in Buddhism, as Nirvana is reached with the realization of Sunyata, the idea that reality is fundamentally undifferentiated and is interconnected. Nirvana is referred to as neti, neither this or that, as no word, sign, or idea could adequately describe something that has no being. Now, this doesn't mean that Nirvana is nothingness or non-being, similar to that which is defined to be exceeded by Sunyata. Instead, it's the same predicate for non-being that references the idea of non-being that also Sunyata uses to say that Sunyata, it is non-dual. So both Sunyata and Nirvana are non-beings in a sense that they're non-dual, and they exceed non-beings in the sense that non-beings are nothingness and nothingness is dual with somethingness, so therefore they do exceed non-beings. And depending on the definition that you use for non-beings, they are non-beings and they exceed these non-beings, right? If you understand what I'm saying, you can just like I don't know, play back like fucking 2 minutes ago, something. But yeah, we're practically done with the non-pseudo-Dionysus approach style of ineffability. Now it's time to get into the actual premise of the video itself, starting with the frameworks that posit the ineffability thesis to understand its applications better. With Neoplatonism, we begin again with Plotinus. We start with Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher, the Greek philosopher that's widely regarded as the founder of Neoplatonism in general. He tackles the problem of the one's transcendence and the one as a source of everything. Plotinus takes the pseudo-Dionysus approach, stating that God is completely transcendent. God is above all thought, all being. God is ineffable and inconceivable. Neither essence, nor being, nor life can be ascribed to God, the one, because it is always something more, it exceeds it. If so, how is it possible for the one to have the ability to create if the one is fundamentally beyond predicates? This is where we're introduced to the concept of emanation, and it is used in unison with the Godhead's aspects. Emanation is a process of spillage from the one. It's not the contemporary definition of creation. It allows for the one to birth being without diminishing the nature of the one and its immutability. To which author Hilary Armstrong attempted to provide a rejection to Plotinus' views in regards to the one being beyond predicate. He begins by listing out a set of attributes unintentionally listed out as a result of how Plotinus posits the one. He speaks about how Plotinus gives it will and how he allows for it to eternally create itself and return to itself, which is a reference as to how the emanation process works, and how all of creation is simply the one in a limited manner, which we will touch upon soon. From which Armstrong infers that if that follows, then the one becomes a being to which predicates can be applied and logical distinctions can be also given to the one. And this is the first blunder to his rejection, being that he assumes the one to be an infinite being, and the process of emanation diminishes the transcendence of the one. The former is an inaccurate interpretation of what Plotinus regards as beyond being. Armstrong took it to mean that the one was an infinite being, meaning that the one is part of being, just distinguishable from finite beings. Just in case you're confused, I covered that definition of infinite beings in my video about the ontological hierarchy, which is just like lessons in ontology part 1. This is more like a part 2 to the video. Now, I say that it misinterprets what Plotinus says strictly because Plotinus speaks of beyond being in a sense that the one is not an infinite being, but the one is responsible for all being, and as a result exceeds the notion of being as a category. So beyond being isn't to say that it is beyond being in the sense that its transcendence is relative to finite beings, hence it's an infinite being. It is to say that the one precedes being entirely, whether or not it's the notion of finite or infinite being. As such, the one isn't really confined by what it precedes, and in fact it exceeds it. Thus the one exceeds being, including infinite being. Being is contingent on the one, and as such, Armstrong's point of contention hinge on the oversimplification of the one's transcendence, as being is limited and these limits for the one cannot adequately describe the one or capture the full nature of the one. For example, if you were to make an ontological relation between the one and being, take for example saying the one is an infinite being, because being intrinsically has limits and being ultimately derives from the one, what derives from the one is intrinsically exceeded by the one. And as such, since the one emanates intellect, the one intrinsically exceeds intellect. Furthermore, another critique that Armstrong who attempted to deduce was that the one being confined by predicates because of the emanation process. But the issue with the emanation process is the fact that the process implies that the one reveals itself into creation by using various manifestations or aspects. For example, it is made clear that the one exists in all things and all things exist within the one, but the one is not identical to all things, and in fact the one exceeds everything and is completely distinct from everything. That is to say, the one's immanence is not identical to the totality of the one's nature, which still remains ineffable. This is supported by Plotinus stating that the one having generative capabilities doesn't diminish the nature of the one. Once again, we're back to what we talked about. This is further supported once again as they refer to the transcendence and immanence of the one as aspects of the one to elucidate the one existing in all things and simultaneously exceeding all. It is important to note that the relation between these aspects are not spatial or temporal and is strictly to be understood from a metaphysical standpoint. The one's generative capabilities are also distinguished from the totality of the one's nature, which demonstrates how the generative capabilities of the one doesn't diminish the totality of the one, which is fundamentally still beyond predicates. That is to say, everything is in the one, but the one only as a generative, not the one's totality of nature or being, which is simply beyond being and predicates once again. This, however, can theoretically pose a challenge to divine unity of the Godhead from Neoplatonism, the one, but divine unity isn't really the topic of this video. To address a few misconceptions, the one is sometimes regarded as the good or identified as such. It is important to note that the good strictly exceeds being as well, because I've seen some people seem to think the term good references good in a moral sense, when it only acts as an identification for the one, which this term is also an aspect of the one, as the one's totality is fundamentally something that exceeds good as well, further strengthening its ineffability and exceeding what already exists beyond being. Now, the last major point is in regards to Neoplatonism, well, the hyper-F model, or otherwise called the hyper-B model of pseudo-Dionysus. Plotinus and pseudo-Dionysus posit the ineffability of the one similarly, so it's insignificant to attempt to elucidate the way in which pseudo-Dionysus posits the transcendence of the one, because that's practically redundant. In any case, the hyper-being model of pseudo-Dionysus simply offers insight, another way for the finite to understand the divine. It speaks about how one can understand the one by appealing to divine revelation, as divine revelation exceeds regular intellect. However, the divine revelation strictly references how the divine reveals itself into creation in a manner in which that which is contingent on it can understand it. Also, it doesn't speak about the capacity to understand the totality of the divine's nature. In simple terms, if you take the one to be perhaps maybe Yahweh from the Bible, then you're gonna get some insight from some of the aspects of Yahweh from the Bible, strictly speaking, because that is divine revelation. Now, moving on to the other frameworks, and we're gonna talk about them not as much as we talked about Neoplatonism, strictly because they literally are similar in the way in which they approach ineffability in a sense. In Cabala, it posits the ineffability thesis for the Atzimus, or a minor yet still strong sense of ineffability towards the Ein Sof and Ayin. It follows a similar process that which is similar to Neoplatonism, emanation. Everything emanates from the Godhead. The Ein Sof, the divine, comes in various aspects in Cabala. It's made more explicit as to what these aspects are rather than in Neoplatonism. At the very top of them all is the core essence of the divine, the Atzimus, which is fundamentally completely ineffable, and it is so ineffable that those who study Jewish mysticism are strictly restricted from speaking too much about it. So as a result, there's always lackluster information in regards to it. But what we do know of it is that no thought can grasp its divine nature, even for that which knows everything, because the Atzimus is fundamentally and intrinsically ineffable. The Ein Sof and Ayin are practically one and the same, and they represent aspects of the divine's transcendence. Ayin is sometimes taken to be akin to Ein Sof, or sometimes Ayin is responsible for the creation of the Ein Sof, depending on your view of the mysticism and the school that which you're appealing to in regards to it. Ayin negates all human concepts as well. It is ultimately infinite and ineffable. The Ein Sof is infinite and beyond attributes and is practically ineffable as well. Because Ayin and Ein Sof are stages in which God progressively reveals himself into creation, allowing for creation to understand some aspects of God, Ein Sof and Ayin aren't fundamentally as ineffable as the Atzimus. The Ayin and Ein Sof are restricted to the expression of them being infinite and a denial of N, not too dissimilar from Hegel's concept of true infinity. Atzimus, on the other hand, is fundamentally ineffable and exceeds the relationship between the finite and infinite, something which Ayin and Ein Sof do not exceed. The emanation process also does not denounce the ineffability of the divine in Cabala. The Ein Sof is that which creates all contingent beings, which the Ein Sof itself does not reflect on the true nature of the divine, as that's strictly referencing the Atzimus. So similarly to Neoplatonism, I guess, in a sense, there are many aspects of God where the divine's totality is still fundamentally ineffable. But hopefully people understand how cataphatic theology and negative theology can come into unison, and most importantly how the ineffability thesis is not something that which should be posited as a standalone, but can be posited alongside cataphatic theology without necessarily diminishing the nature of the fundamentally ineffable being. And hopefully people now understand the way in which negative theology can be posited, and similarly the ineffability thesis and its applications of both, and how they can be posited in certain theological frameworks without necessarily denouncing the fundamental nature of the ultimate or God or divinity, because that still remains practically ineffable. And I'll see you in the next video. Maybe it's going to be about absolute divine simplicity, or maybe I'll be responding to a request that somebody made, which is to explain elementary embeddings in set theory. I'll think more about it, but I hope you enjoy your day.